thank you all for joining. And I see some familiar names here, which I am very glad that are joining us. So I am Lorena Rivero, for those who do not know me yet. And today we have with us Omar Guerrero. It's very exciting for us to have him here. He is a senior research fellow at the Department of Economics in the University College of London and at the Alan Turing Institute. And the UK's National Institute for Data Science, for those who do not know the Alan Turing Institute, and Artificial Intelligence. So he has been a fellow at the Oxford Martin School, the Side Business School, and the Institute of New Economic Thinking at the University of Oxford. So he now works in the intersection of development, economics, and sustainability. So everything to do with the topics we are dealing now, and trying to understand how policy priorities translate into effective development. He's going to showcase this very exciting project that uses different sources of data and gives us analysis for policy. This is highly innovative in this area for SDGs. And before we get all into that, I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to this topic on the innovation and data analysis for SDGs. So today we are focusing on innovation on data analysis. So innovation can be very broad, and innovation for SDGs, we can hear it going on all around from different points of view. So today we're going to focus only on how these data analysis can inform budget decision-making for SDGs. So it's a very specific type of innovation that we're dealing here now. So first up, I wanted to take a look back at our friends, the bees. So our friends, the bees, you have probably heard how bees have been considered now the most important being in the world. If you haven't heard that, it's because they reflect this very fragile balance that we have between the environment and our sustainability in this planet. In this case study, they have been using around Europe, analyzing how beehives are declining and using real-time sensor data from beehives to analyze how pesticides and other types of stressors affect the bees community. And this is a very important case because it has stressed how data can actually have implications not only in one country's budget or not just one policy, but this has shaped the way policy, lawmaking, and other types of decisions have been made in the European Union in the past couple of years. So this is a reflection of what we're looking for and where we're going, how data analysis can have an incidence in policymaking, in budgets, lawmaking, and can be reflected along the way in all our priorities. Evidence in policymaking is more important than ever because let's remember and always keep in mind that SDGs are a very complex agenda. As we can see in this diagram, and it's a diagram that looks very complex if you are not that much into SDG agenda, but what it says is how all the aspects are interlinked. Before the SDGs, we would say, okay, let's look at economic development. But now we know that if we only look at economic development and we don't care about the environment, we're not having this long-term development that we expect. So the interrelation between different targets is important. So evidence in policymaking is more important than ever because of SDGs, and also because it is more possible than ever. So why is it more important than ever? Because we have more data than ever. And data gives us different options that we did not have before. We have more data, but we also have alternative sources of data. So I always like to remember, and many of the times they come and ask us, but what about when in certain countries with more fragile economies, they don't have good statistics offices? How do we use this data? What about the quality of the data? That's the importance of innovation, and that's the importance of the alternative sources of data. We can access different types of data, and here I have some examples. This geolocation, credit card transactions, email recipients, social media posts. There are so many ways of using these alternative sources of data that this gives us a possibility that we did not have before. So again, evidence in policy making is more possible than ever. Additionally, the cost of data storage and transmission. Here is a diagram of a very good book that I would definitely recommend for the ones who are here, Life 3.0, is how much has it costed before to store data. So now we store data about everything, all the transactions. Every time we wake up, we go to sleep, we are producing data. And before we had the option of storing all this data, it could not be used. It was being produced, but not stored at any point. So now we have this option of storing data and the computer processing. And this is going to go a lot into what Omar is going to showcase, because when we are moving into this analysis of big data, of other sources of data, this gives us a possibility, again, that we did not have before. And again, we ask all the time, like, why are we always talking about this machine learning or this artificial intelligence? Why? Because it is important and it is possible now. But still, something that we see is in ministries of finance or even statistical institutes is performance evaluation and data policy agendas going separate ways. And there's a very sweet spot when this performance evaluation that feedbacks budgets and data policy unites to actually create better budgets and better policies. And that's what we want to achieve. And that's what we try to achieve with this for the SDGs. Because if we only focus on being on SDG events, but we don't actually implement, there's nothing going to happen. So this is the sweet spot that we're searching for. And then we come back to our friends, the bees, and how this has happened in the case of Europe. So what we see is that by using alternative sources of data and fitting it to researchers and policy making that are different users and actors, we can have implications at the macro level. So we can see these options that require different support from the budgets and require different alternatives in the policy making. But something that we need this to happen, it's to better link policy and budget cycle. And this might seem like it's not rocket science, but in most cases, line ministries and ministries of finance have this interaction. We still see the bottom-down budgeting or bottom-up budgeting, depends on the stage of the country, that do not take into account external sources of data, only government sources of data, but also that line ministries are seeing themselves as silos. So with these different flows of data, we have another option of how these interlinked can improve policy making and the budget cycle. And furthermore, since we have this fast transmission of data and these possibilities of actually interacting with more people, it's the first time that we can think of a different co-creation and crowdsourcing from civil society, from private sector, from the government. And we can have people being active and being part of this process of development. And this is the first time that we can actually say that, because we can say that we can act with the same data. Of course, this is as long as government and private sector are making their data available, which pinpoints again the importance of having open data and interlinked data. And something else I want to emphasize in this sense is government is very difficult to have all the specializations. So every time that we have more and more special fields, and bringing in private enterprises, bringing in civil society, understanding how GovTech can help us, we can achieve better solutions. So this is part of the point of what we're searching. And of course, with new possibilities come new challenges, which is how to find the appropriate data solution to complex policy questions. So this is a question for you, Omar. How to get access to privately owned data sources and ensure that there is interoperability across these data sets and models. How can we advance these analytics that are timely, which is very important, simple and clear to process for decision making. And of course, we love the words artificial intelligence and machine learning, but how do we distinguish between hype, false promises, and real added value? So some takeaways that I hope we can address during this session is to remember the SDGs are linked, and they require very deep analysis that we were not doing before. They require for us to actually think not in silos, check how one policy affects other policies, but also how the policy from one government affects the policies of another government. And we can think of that with the fire in the Amazons these days. That is really a tragedy that it's going to affect us all around the world. And so this is the coordination that we need. We cannot see ourselves as silos anymore. But the good thing is data is available now, even through alternative data sources. And finally, something that is a wishful thinking for all of the people here present: if you have data, make it available openly, because you never know who can innovate with it. And with these couple of questions, I'm going to leave the forum to Omar, who I'm very glad to have here to present his model of the Policy Priorities Inference model.
Thanks a lot for the introduction, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm thrilled to be participating in these webinars. And the stuff that I will present now actually speaks a lot to what Lorena just talked about. And I will take a little bit further Lorena's argument about the importance of data. And I will say also that it's not only data, but we need to also understand the processes that generate the data. So the social processes, interactions that give rise to these enormous amounts of information. It will be very important to model it explicitly, because only then we can understand causal relationships. And that has to do a lot with policymaking. And so as Lorena said, the project is called Policy Priority Inference. And now we have added the term for sustainable development because we started working with the UNDP. So first, before jumping into the substance, I want first to acknowledge the work of my collaborator and co-author, Gonzalo Castañeda, who is a fantastic economist in Mexico. And then the support of the UNDP, which was the first organization to spot the potential of our tool, and then has been sponsoring a project to adapt it to the Sustainable Development Goals. And then, of course, my home institution, the Alan Turing Institute, and the National Laboratory for Public Policy in Mexico, which is the other partner in this project with the UNDP. So in order to introduce the project, it's useful always to show you this picture and think about development as a process. So let's think of development as some kind of machinery with a lot of moving parts. And like every process, it takes some inputs and produces outputs. So let's see at the outputs. So typically, we can think of the outputs as the development indicators that countries produce, that statistical agents put together in order to track the progress of the nation towards specific goals in certain policy issues. And now we all know that a lot of countries produce this data with various degrees of quality and coverage. And that, for instance, in the Sustainable Development Goal framework, there are 232 official indicators, but different countries might have more or less. And basically, most of the focus regarding data generation has been on this aspect of the development process, on the output. So what about the input? So we can think of various types of inputs, right? So we could think of human capital, different types of capacities, innovations from companies, or even international aid, for instance. But the more obvious to you, obviously to this network, is actually what government spends in public policies to reach certain development goals. So ideally, we want to have data on this input to understand how this input transforms into the dynamics that we observe in indicators. The problem is, or at least it was when I started doing this work with Gonzalo, was that there wasn't any data about this side of the process. Fortunately, this is changing, right? So GIFT is doing some fantastic work to change this. And hopefully in the future, we're going to have enough data to match the output side. So what I will present to you is going to be under the assumption that there is no data about the expenditure on SDGs. And I will come back to this picture at the end of the talk to address how the new data that has been generated with the support of GIFT can really enhance this methodology. So having this picture of the policy of the development process, and in the absence of the input data, what we have to do then is kind of reverse engineer the whole process, right? So we have data about the output, the indicators, then we need to model whatever is producing that data. So this has to do with what are the social processes that are generating the indicators. So we're going to try to model that machine in the middle of the picture and then infer the data that we don't have which would reflect in the policy priorities, right? The allocation of resources across different policy issues. But this is a complex problem, as Lorena was pointing out, because there are interdependencies and there is also a whole political economy process. So let me give you our mental model of this process. So I want you to think about a central authority, which is this little white building in the middle. This central authority could be a ministry of the treasury or it could be an executive office. And the task of this government is to allocate resources across various policy issues that I have illustrated here with some SDGs. So suppose that this office allocates some resources to improve the quality of education. And sitting in the office responsible for quality of education, we have an agent or an agency that is in charge of transforming those resources into the outputs of the process, into changes in the indicators that are important to measure the quality of education. But there are some issues here, right? Because we know very well that inputs in policymaking, they do not necessarily translate into outputs, or at least into the desired outputs. There are inefficiencies in the policymaking process. And inefficiencies can be of various natures. For instance, they could be just lack of capital to implement the policies, lack of capacity. You could have terrible contracts with the third-party companies that are hired to implement the policies, or you could just have plain corruption, for instance. But okay, we know that governments have certain public governance mechanisms to try to monitor how the inputs are transforming into outputs and try to estimate these inefficiencies. And here's where the complexity aspect comes in, because now you have spillover effects. So suppose you have improvements also in SDG 3, which has to do with public health, and also in public infrastructure in the SDG 11. So imagine that now kids in certain rural communities in a given country, they have all their vaccines, so they can be in school more often. They also have public transport now that can take them to the schools instead of walking for hours on the roads. And only because of that, they're going to improve their grades. They're going to have a better performance in the tests. And often these type of international tests can be development indicators for measuring the quality of education. So improvements in education indicators are happening because of spillovers, not necessarily because of the resources that the government has put into improving the quality of education. And this might change the incentives that the policymaker has in terms of becoming more inefficient, right? So now extend this to an entire network of policy issues and to the fact that the government or the central authority has to allocate across different topics. This is quite a complex problem, and traditional statistical techniques that only look at data per se are not going to be helpful. We need to model this social process. So you can think about our approach, Policy Priority Inference, PPI, as a computational model. So we're going to explicitly model individual agents, so a central authority that has to deal with allocating resources. We're going to have artificial agents in charge of transforming those resources. And you can think of it as a software package that takes some inputs in terms of data. So what are the inputs? So the first are, of course, the development indicators. So if you have a time series of various indicators covering the SDGs, for example, you're going to use those as the inputs of the model. These are going to provide also some specificity to the context of the country that you are studying. The next input is the network of interdependencies. And there are various ways to actually estimate these networks. If you have a lot of data, you can use very sophisticated statistical techniques. And if you don't have, often what is common is to gather groups of experts to try to determine these networks. So whichever is the way in which you determine it, that's going to be another input. So the model is going to account for these interdependencies. And the third input is the aspirations that the government has. So these would be the specific values that a government would want to achieve for each of the indicators in the data. So if you're thinking, for example, I want to infer what were the priorities of a government during a given sample period of data. In that case, you can assume that the aspirations of the government were the final values of that data. And what the approach is going to do is it's going to replicate the dynamics of how those indicators reach their final values. And in that process is going to give you the inference about, okay, these were the priorities that the government established. That's how it reached those goals. An alternative would be, well, I'm not interested in the retrospective analysis. Instead, I want to ask how feasible is to reach, for instance, another set of indicators. If I want, let's say, I want to emulate another country that is very advanced in various aspects that matter to me, then you could actually bring those as part of your aspirations. So some of the outputs that PPI produces are, of course, the priorities, so the distribution of resources. It also provides estimates on inefficiencies with a high level of detail. And And a very useful output is also the feasibility of reaching certain goals. It's going to give you estimates of how many years it's going to take you to reach those goals. So for those of you who might be interested in, okay, but what's going on in your model? What exactly are you modeling? Who are the agents? So without entering in too much detail, I'm going to give you a sketch of what goes on behind this. So think about the central authority that I told you about. So that's this building at the top. And this central authority has certain goals in mind. So remember, these are the aspirations that you inputted into the model. The government allocates resources to the various agencies in charge of advancing the indicators. These agents transform those resources, and then those resources produce changes in the different indicators. There are the spillover effects going on between the different dimensions of development. And remember that agents also have incentives to become inefficient. If you might have a lot of positive synergies, incoming synergies, that might incentivize you to actually do less work, for instance. And remember that also the government is trying to monitor this. So even if the monitoring is imperfect, every now and then inefficiencies might be spotted. And because of that, the agents that are inefficient might be penalized. So there is a behavioral component here. The agents are going to learn from this experience, and social norms about corruption and inefficiencies are going to emerge. And finally, the government also keeps track of who are the most efficient sectors, how far am I doing from my goals in certain issues. So there is some gap consideration here. So the government also adapts the policy priorities. So you can see that this is a system that is not static, it's not in equilibrium, it's a coevolutionary system. And this is the kind of model approach that we take. So what problems can PPI tackle? So one of them is looking at the synergies and the trade-offs, right? I told you that you can input certain networks. So by changing the links in those networks, you could learn what synergies are better to promote and where trade-offs are better to discourage. Of course, as I said previously, you can infer the policy priorities. You can also quantify policy coherence. Some of you might have read some of these papers by the OECD on policy coherence. It's a big topic. We provide the first method to quantify it. You can estimate the different types of inefficiencies. Technical inefficiencies are those that have to do with the policymaking process, the ones I mentioned. And allocative inefficiencies have to do with overspending or underspending in certain issues for a given set of goals. You can also design more effective, let's say, aspirations, so more realistic aspirations that you could more feasibly achieve. You can explore whether emulating certain countries or certain development models is something feasible for your given context. So is it easier for me to emulate the Nordic model or maybe a more kind of Anglo-Saxon type of economy? And what about accelerators? This is a very big topic in the UNDP agenda today. So we actually have a method as well to identify accelerators through PPI. And in the first webinar, for instance, the representatives from DESA were talking about this report on public governance. So we actually have something to say there, and we have a couple of papers on this. So you can use PPI to evaluate the impact of improvements in governance. And some of the virtues of PPI are, for instance, that, of course, we have an explicit model of the policymaking process, which if you only look at the data and use just classic statistics, you're not going to have. We also have, it also considers interdependencies between SDGs. The model is actually very scalable. That's something you cannot get with traditional statistics. So you can keep adding more and more indicators. Lorena was talking about all these new type of data sources from private companies, etc. You can bring them in. You can have larger networks of interdependencies, and the approach scales very well. It takes into account the context of the specific countries. So contrary to traditional regressions, you don't need to put together data on different countries, because the moment you do that, you lose the context of the country that you want to advise. Here, we can actually work only with the data of a specific country. And it also allows some validation. I will touch on this at the end of the presentation. Inefficiencies again, and it is very flexible. If you have very specific information of how your government behaves, you can actually specify it in the model because of its computational nature. And you can implement it to analyze policy priorities at the national level, at the subnational level, or only within a sector. If you have indicators on telecommunications or on health, you can do sectorial analysis. So this is a typical example of an output. So this would be a distribution of resources for a simulation. So this was made from data from the World Economic Forum for a given period. And this is what we call the retrospective analysis, what I mentioned earlier. So we basically simulated the indicators starting from their initial values, reaching their final values, and then inferring what was the distribution of resources of our artificial government that led to those values. And here we did an exercise with 80 indicators. Here we have aggregated them in 13 pillars. And you can see basically that this would be an allocation of resources. Now, what is more interesting is to look at the prospective analysis, which I also mentioned, which has to do with, well, maybe I want to see what should my priorities be if I want to emulate another country. So let me give you the example of Mexico. So we simulate Mexico, trying, instead of reaching the values from the data set, the final values, trying to reach the values of Switzerland, of the indicators of Switzerland. So those would be the priorities in that data sample that Mexico would have to establish. You can see that education should be a top priority with improving public governance, followed by R&D. But what about if Mexico changes the development mode? What about if it would want to emulate Japan? Then you can see that there is a reordering of priorities. So governance and education switch places, but then business sophistication jumps up a few steps in this ladder. So this tells you also the importance of who you want to be and the context specificity. And taking advantage of these two examples, the retrospective analysis and the prospective, then we can talk about policy coherence. So in this plot, what you have in the horizontal axis, you have this distribution of resources. I have disaggregated it now at the level of the 80 indicators. So in the horizontal axis, you have the distribution of resources for the retrospective analysis. So that is what we inferred that Mexico did in the sampling period. And in the vertical axis, you have what Mexico would have done if it would have become Japan. So what does this mean? It means that if Mexico's priorities would have been consistent with the idea of becoming Japan, all those dots would be on top of the diagonal line. And this is very useful because now we can measure the distances from that diagonal line in order to assess coherence, policy coherence, right? So if the dots are very far apart, that means that the strategy, the priorities were not very coherent. So we're going to develop a policy coherence index that is very intuitive. It actually behaves like a correlation coefficient. So it goes from -1 to 1. If it is negative, it means that the priorities were incoherent. If it is positive, that means that the priorities were coherent. And we're going to repeat this exercise. We're going to estimate this index for all the countries in the OECD, which arguably Mexico could have emulated since Mexico joined the OECD in the 90s. So here are the results. So the vertical axis shows the policy coherence index for Mexico as if it would have tried to emulate each one of the earlier OECD members. We have sorted the members according to their income per capita. The red line denotes the income per capita for Mexico at that sampling period. And you can see that in general, Mexico has not been coherent with the priorities in order to become similar to those model countries. But of course, if you're not familiar with the case of Mexico, maybe this is not telling you much, right? As far as you're concerned, this could be just random points. But what if I show you a case of a successful country? Let's talk about Korea. So Korea, which also joined the OECD in the 1990s, is known to be a very successful case of development. Not only that, but it has been well documented that Korea had tried to follow the Japanese development model very aggressively. So in this scatter plot that I just showed you, Japan should be up in the high numbers, right? So here is Korea. Korea trying to emulate each one of the OECD members. Here you can see first that all the indices for Korea are positive. So Korea is overwhelmingly coherent with being similar, becoming similar to the OECD countries. And Japan is there at the top, which was very surprising to us because we are not imputing any prior knowledge about this information into the model. This is coming from the data and having a robust theory of the policymaking process. What about a second example, Estonia, who joined more recently, but it is also known to have tried to emulate the Nordic countries. So here you go. Denmark, Finland, and Sweden, the three Nordic countries among the top 5 countries with which Estonia has been more coherent. Estonia in general has been less coherent than Korea, but it's to be expected. It's at least developed country, but the results again are amazing. And it is important to mention that you could construct this index using data, for example, just the indicators, just the data by itself, and you would not get these results. So this highlights the importance of understanding the process underlying the data and to model that process. And finally, I just want to go back to the picture that I showed you initially. So as you have seen, all this has been constructed assuming that there is no data about the input, fiscal data on SDGs. But what if we have fiscal data? So this is the next step, and we're working together with the UNDP and with GIFT to develop the next generation of PPI. And you can do so many things with data. For instance, if you know that your government already has established budgetary priorities, you can fix those priorities and evaluate whether they are coherent or not. You could also do exercises, for instance, say that you expect the budget to increase in 5% in the next fiscal exercise, and you have some margin or flexibility in allocating that 5%. Where should you put it in? Well, depends what are the goals that you want to achieve. Should you perhaps promote certain accelerators? Should you try to achieve the goals faster, or to decrease inefficiencies? So we can actually address for those questions. And the more data, the more we will be able to do. And to close, besides thanking you all for listening to me, I give you this couple of links where you can find some of the material of the project that is being developed with the UNDP for the specific case of Mexico, which will produce a few technical reports that will come out in December. And well, it's a big agenda that is growing, and you will hear more from us in the future, and I will be happy to take any questions.
Wow, so this is a big model. Thank you very much for sharing, Omar. Indeed, we are working with Omar in this feeding of the data, and something that came to my mind, Omar, and I would like to also hear your thoughts on that, because taxes also play a big part in this. Tax exemptions, the modeling of the taxes, and how could these fit in the model, just because it's not just the input of the budget, but how you model all your fiscal. So what are your thoughts on this?
So something to have also in mind about PPI is that it is a macro model. So it's going to help you to think about ordering priorities, but it's not going to tell you then, once you have ordered those priorities, what specific programs should you implement to get the best outcomes. So that you would need other type of methods. But even with that caveat, you could think of different ways of incorporating some dimensions of taxation. The most natural one would be an indicator, right? So if you have built an indicator of, for example, effectiveness in tax collection, and that improving across time, when you estimate your networks of interdependency, that indicator, which is a node in the network, should actually condition the movement of many other indicators. So if you are able to capture that and to put it in your network, then PPI can take it in a very natural way. And then other ways to think about it, which would be more complicated, would be actually to diving into the model itself and the kind of the behaviors of the government, and putting there some parameters here and there on the, how effectively can the government allocate certain resources, or some loss of resources because of bad taxing capacity. But I would first approach it through the network side.
I am sure that many of the people here, I see some that have already read the initial blog post. I see Gustavo or Ramon here. If you would like, yeah. Okay, I see here Sebastian Kodats. Not only taxation, in fact, the IADB has estimated regulation in general can explain economic growth by around 12%. Yeah, so indeed, it's not just about the collection of taxes, but how we are designing the taxes. So that is an important thing. Thank you, Sebastian. About the indicators, and okay, Ramon here, can you expand a bit more on the type of statistical model that you use to conduct the inferences? Do you get confidence intervals by each estimation and control variables?
So yes, so the statistics are done through Monte Carlo simulation, basically. So because this is a non-equilibrium system, you might have different outcomes from one simulation to another, because you might have path dependencies and all these sorts of complex dynamics. So what you have to do is to run many independent simulations, and then build. So one source of uncertainty would be just uncertainty from the simulations themselves. But then what you can do as well is, if your indicators have errors or kind of a measurement of uncertainty, you can actually propagate those through the model in the Monte Carlo simulation by randomly specifying the values within the interval of error of your indicators. So yeah, that can be done very naturally, and we do have kind of measures of error for the inferences.
So this is becoming a very technical webinar, which I'm glad that we're having, because there are many questions around this model that I would not like to leave. So Sebastian Codas is asking if you could explain more about how you classify indicators for every topic.
Yes.
How do you incorporate the interdependence you mentioned?
Okay, so those are two big questions. So the first, and has a quick answer, is that in the projects, for instance, that we're running with the UNDP, we're starting with a classification already given by the UN databases and the World Bank databases on SDGs. And then we have augmented that database a little bit with things that are of importance to Mexico. But I have to say that some classifications might vary from country to country. So the example that I find fascinating is, for example, financial development. Many indicators about financial development officially for the SDGs for the UN, they fall within SDG 8, right? Economic growth. But in Mexico, those indicators actually are in SDG 1, poverty. So it's something that you have to actually talk with the experts on where you're applying the method. The second question that has to do with the networks. So I would be happy to point you to a link, because we actually have a paper, a very extensive review. I think it's the only review out there on different methods to estimate networks from SDG data. You cannot take just any method. For example, if you're an economist, you might be familiar with these grandeur causality methods. Those methods won't work because development indicator data have very few observations. So we will have to provide the information about this.
So about, are you feeding more internal indicators that governments are having, for example, to measure their outputs, not only the SDGs indicators, but their outputs? And how about bumping into bad indicators?
Yep. So the first part, yes, we're doing that with Mexico. For instance, we have included these indicators from the National Commission for Evaluation of the Social Programs, the Coneval. And then some other food-related indicators, because for the government, some food security issues are important. And so as long as you have indicators, you can incorporate them, given that they fulfill certain requirements about coverage and number of observations. And regarding back data, well, so the model can do a lot with pretty small data, with pretty short time series. You can actually do a lot with 10 or even a little bit less than 10 observations and a lot of dimensions, so that no other method can do. But of course, the better the data you have, the better the inferences. So garbage in, garbage out. So the model is not going to solve your problems of bad quality of data. That's something that it's a global agenda that a bigger community has to be working on.
So in parallel with the countries that decide to work with us on this piloting this PPI with the Open Fiscal Data Package, we can as well have the agenda on improving indicators and improving data quality as parallel. So Gustavo here is, are you planning to work with governments? It seems you are working with Mexico. I want to know what kind of team a country must have to work with a project like this. Also, if you are going to offer through IADB, World Bank, etc.
Yes, so the project with Mexico, the UNDP has done a fantastic work in basically putting together a review committee that has been participating in so far 2 workshops that we have run down there. And this review committee brings representatives from the Office of the President, from the Ministry of the Treasury, so Lorena's ex-colleagues, and that's from the federal side. But we also, for instance, for this second workshop, there was a fantastic response, and we increased from having 2 state governments who were interested in the tool to having 6. And now also some NGOs are interested, because this tool can be used to evaluate, right? And we are in talks with the UNDP about the next countries in which we are going to start producing reports. And of course, we are open to bring this to any international organization who is interested. We have a whole agenda of delivering workshops, training, and once the project with Mexico is done, we're going to release the first kind of big open source deliverables in terms of coding and data sets. So we're going to build more on that, and happy to talk about it with anyone interested.
So the good thing here, and I think Gustavo asked, because they have extensive data on this, they're in Argentina, they are working also towards SDG budgeting and have extensive open data on budget allocations and spending. So that would be great. And something that I would like to highlight here, and something that you commented, is the role of external organizations in this process and how they can actually use this model. So this is not only important information for governments, but also for civil society or researchers. How do you see that happening?
Exactly. And for instance, for my camp, which is the research one, just the fact of being able to generate synthetic data on priorities, which did not exist before, allows you to do a lot of different studies that we were not able to do prior. So we have a paper on corruption, on how why corruption has not decreased in certain countries in spite of having very important public governance reforms. So we actually, PPI allows us to introduce this idea of it's not only about the principal agent model, but it has also to do with collective action, for instance. And because we are able to simulate these priorities, that helps us to do some further inferences. Policy resilience would be another paper on that. So it allows you to do a lot of things that before it was very hard without this kind of data.
So two things that I always like to emphasize is the importance of how you collect the data and the importance of how you use the data, because the model is not going to tell you finally what decision to make. It gives you analysis and priorities. So it's important that all these actors are together to increase the impact of this analysis, which is a very good input to know towards where we're going. And here I have Sebastian adding to Gustavo's question regarding replicating the simulations. What tools are needed besides good data sources? Generic statistical software, or you have developed a specialized tool? Have you thought about R to aid with replicating the model?
Yes. So
what tools are you using, please?
So you're the first one who actually asked me this. So that is great because that's always a concern in my mind. So right now, everything has been done in the Python programming language. So the libraries will be in Python. And it's still, I think, too far away from being accessible to a wider community of policymakers who might not be technically experts. So in the plans for next year is exactly investing into developing an R package. And also if the UNDP in the end really is convinced about all these things, we might be talking of maybe a website, right, with an interactive app. But we're talking already in a year or two horizon.
Wishful thinking.
Yeah, very.
Well, one of the things and the importance of the role of the data community, and as you know, all who are here from GIFT, we have approached a lot the data community, and using Python is something actually becoming quite common now on the data use community, and replacing R in many cases. In other cases, R is still a standard because it's the most widely known and used. But still, there is an increasing community that can actually use this data through Python and model it. Gustavo, how many time is estimated to the project to give conclusions, assuming that the government has enough data to feed the model?
I'm not sure I got the question.
So how long would it take to run the model for another country if you have all the data?
It's pretty straightforward. I think what takes most of the time is calibrating it, because there are some parameters there for each indicator that regulate the time it takes to get to the goals. Basically, those parameters would represent everything else that is not considered in our model. And that becomes kind of a computational intensive procedure, which, to give some context, should not take more than an hour so far with 140 indicators. So you can escalate this escalates, if you are technical about this, so with the number of indicators, the model escalates polynomially, which is not too bad. And yeah, that's the only part, and running the Monte Carlo simulation is just straightforward.
So thankful again to what I was saying. We have computational power now, and it's possible to achieve this very, very fast. I have one more question that's coming from our technical advisor, who asked us offline, since he's very far away and in another time now, aren't we assuming that the budget is too directly linked to the outcomes?
Well, that's what we actually model. So what I said in the beginning is that inputs do not necessarily generate the desired outputs. So the whole point of introducing inefficiencies is exactly addressing that problem. And there is another component that I didn't mention, which has to do with the monitoring mechanism. There you have actually components on quality of monitoring and the rule of law. And those are big determinants on how good is that, or how direct is that connection between the resources and the movement of the indicators.
Here, Sebastian Codas is asking if you think that the process can be participative, but I am not sure of what you mean with this, Sebastian.
I think I know.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Okay.
So this
meaning
question,
using public opinion or consultation. Sorry.
Exactly. So yes, it can be, especially in the part of the network, right? Because you can use very sophisticated methods, for instance, to infer these interlinkages. And actually, the best methods are in R, not in Python. So you're going to end up using both languages. But obviously, expert advice on links that make no sense is always useful, right? You want to remove those links, or you want to make sure that certain links actually exist in your network. So that is the best way to introduce. Another participatory approach that actually we have used with the project with the UNDP is that we have two types of nodes. So if you think about it, not all the indicators in a database have policy instruments. And this has to do with the question about how direct are the resources. So not all the resources can be actually allocated to all the topics. Some topics just move by a natural inertia or by spillovers from other topics. So we introduce a classification we call instrumental nodes, those indicators where you actually have an explicit expenditure program, and then collateral nodes, those ones where expenditure doesn't have a direct incidence. Classifying those indicators, that's a great way to involve the stakeholders.
Okay, defining what has direct impact and what does not.
Yep.
Kind of like micmac models. Great. So I don't know, Gustavo here and the ones who have been more participative, but those who have not posted any questions, please be sure to let us know in case you have any questions. Let's keep this conversation going. There is a blog post that we are going to share with us about the model where it's stated, please, if you're interested in your country joining, modeling this, send me an email. We'll get this in contact. This is a project that, as Omar mentioned, it's still analyzing how to include this and what we can do with other countries that have their data in the open fiscal data package that can be a very good source of this information. So let's keep this conversation going. Thank you very much, Omar, for answering all these questions and this great presentation. I am sure that it's going to get a lot of hype when we post it on social media. And thank you all for being very participative on this. And please, we'll keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.